Stephen, thanks for joining us. This is great to have you here. And thanks for as long as I've got you here, thanks for Monktoberfest. That was so great.
No, thank you. I mean, it was great to have everybody there. Really appreciate you coming out to speak, and man, it's just good to see people in person. It's hard to do safely, but there's parts that you just can't duplicate.
You guys did a great job. And actually, do you mind just kicking off a little bit on how you on the kind of the way you operated the conference from a safety perspective? Because I'm not seeing other conferences do that, and I thought you all did a terrific job.
So, we tried to do a couple things. So we switched our venue. So our old venue was great. It was a public library in town, Portland, Maine, that is, and it's a fantastic facility, but it's underground. There's no circulation, nothing. So we moved venues. We had a much bigger, wider space, which had a big garage door at one end, doors at the other, so we can get some airflow. We invested in air filtration. So we just brought in a couple portable filters, whatever the wire cutter recommendation was. And then I believe it was through Corey Gilmore. I think that's where we got the name. Anyway, we found a contractor called Attend Safe, and they basically mailed tests to everybody. They took proof of vaccination, and it was just they took the heavy lifting off our side, because we knew all the way, sort of all along we wanted to do, have a vaccination requirement and test and all that, but trying to do all that on top of the event logistics would have just been a nightmare. So, there were a couple hiccups here and there, but by and large, it seems to, as far as I know, we haven't sort of been a super spreader event. We had a couple people not attend because the pre-event testing flagged they were positive. We had one person at the event test positive, and I've been sort of waiting with bated breath, but I haven't heard anybody else who caught it. So it
was much appreciated as an attendee, and it was. I think you took a very conscientious approach, and it allowed us to get. Because you said it was great to be back in person again, so it was. Yeah. Trying to find a way to do that safely. And Adam, you've never been to Monktoberfest, I don't think, have you?
Never on the bucket list. I definitely really want to go. Waiting for that.
So angry. Exactly.
Nobody to blame but me. But I would love to go someday.
What we need is I want to do Monktober West. I confess.
Should we do it in Portland as well?
Oh my God!
I think this is like a libel or a slander suit.
Exactly. It's lovely to be in. I've learned not to wade into the Portland dispute. It's lovely to be in Portland, Maine, and it was a great conference, and I know it's rightfully on a bunch of bucket lists, and I feel privileged to have been there. So thanks again, Stephen, for having us. It was terrific.
Pleasure.
And then I feel like before we get to open source, do we get to talk a little bit of baseball?
God, I hope so. Come on.
Well, that depends. Like, we're not going to talk about our season, right? We're going to talk about other seasons.
Of course, no. We are only going to crap on other teams, because all of our teams have been are a disappointment.
Yeah, so, baseball season's been over for 3 months. Right?
Exactly. 3 months. How about 6, pal? Did you watch? Because Adam, I know child duty prevented you from watching any of the games this weekend.
Live, yes. I got a bunch of replays, but yeah.
And Stephen, I don't know, do you watch baseball with your daughter? Is she at the level? Is she at the age where she can appreciate it yet?
I get her to watch like probably 10 minutes of a Red Sox game, maybe.
Right, there you go.
Thereabouts. That's about it. No, I didn't actually watch for the most part. I had the radio feeds up, and bless MLB for not subjecting it to the national feed. So then I don't have to listen to Smoltz and everything else. It's like, okay, great.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Pick a feed. It's lovely.
So unlike the two of you who really grew up as baseball fans, both Red Sox fans, I did not really grow up a baseball fan at all. Baseball is a pure post-kid thing for me. I only got into baseball when my kids got into baseball. So for me, like being a baseball fan is pure. And so I'm just really trying to give you both hope that there is that you will not have to, in the future, you will not have to choose between family time and baseball time. These things become one and the same. So it was.
That'd be great. If I could pull that off, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know like plenty of people are not baseball fans, but if you watching postseason baseball, the thing about baseball, if you are not a baseball fan, is that baseball, if you don't understand necessarily what's going on, like cricket, it can feel boring. But the thing about baseball is it can really hold you on the edge of your seat for a long period of time. And definitely, I mean, we're obviously all rooting against the Astros, please. I mean, this goes without saying.
I guess we are, but in other words, like,
Jesus Christ, do you have the same problem as Adam and I have a boss who has a little too much ambiguity around.
You're talking about a fandom that I don't remember what years this was, but they had an Easter egg hunt at the old was it Veterans Stadium, Philly? And they had these Easter egg hunts.
Okay,
so all the kids came out, and all the fans booed the kids who didn't find an egg. And you're just like,
it's City of Brotherly Love. Okay, so first of all, I like the fact that you are in no way attempting to defend the Astros. You are merely making a case
which is the lesser of two evils.
Exactly. I actually dislike the other team even more, which I've got total respect for. Because we're obviously and actually because you don't watch a baseball game with like Alexander, I know you and I both watched Tobin play, Adam, but you and I have not watched. And my 15-year-old is very opinionated. This apple did not fall far from the tree, and apparently all of the venom that I've got reserved for, I think, like nerdier stuff, he definitely pours into sports and he's got some opinions about the Astros. This is right versus wrong for him. So,
I mean, you got the cheating scandal. I mean, I could go on, and then I mean. You got like A-Rod announcing.
Here's the thing: is that the thing I find interesting is that I would say the overwhelming majority of the people who are down on the Astros, and I'm not defending them, but it's interesting that this is uniquely bad. And then you ask them like, "Oh, you've heard the shot heard around the world, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, of course." Like it's a seminal moment in baseball history, and you're like, "Yeah, they had a radio feed for the call, right?" So he knew exactly what pitch was coming. It's essentially exactly the same setup, just with 40s technology instead. And people are like, "Wait, what? This has happened?" And you're like, "Yeah, literally, the history of the sport is a history of cheating. They come up with new and different ways to do it. The technology changes, but the cheating literally never does." So I don't know. It's fun.
It is that certainly there is truth to that, but I think it's also the when you've got when you've got kind of one team that's kind of violating the mores of the sport that you I feel that and what actually resulted in rule changes, right? I mean that they actually, for those that don't know, the Astros were in 2017. They were stealing signs so the batter could determine what pitch is coming. So if you're not a baseball fan, when you are what you are watching when you're watching a batter at the plate, they are psychologically, physiologically blind for the last 2/3 that ball is traveling to the plate. And the difference between a fastball and a changeup is really just a difference of velocity. And if you know which one is coming, you know to lay off the changeup. This is too much inside baseball for folks, I'm sure. But what the Astros they were intercepting the signs from the catcher. They were intercepting the communications from the catcher to the pitcher by having a camera in the outfield, and then they were then conveying that electronically, and they were banging on a drum to indicate which pitch was coming. And as Stephen is pointing out, this is not the first time that signs have been stolen. This has happened like over and over again in baseball history, right, Stephen?
Over and over and over. So, yeah.
But no more because they are now communicating via a headset to the pitcher.
Yeah, and the vendor for that headset has claimed that it's totally unhackable. So
Well, there you go.
And so actually something, Adam, that I have not told you yet, and actually Steven's on this. My oldest is pitching in college, and he will pitch with a headset this year.
Oh wow, like the Pitchtronic or whatever it is.
Yeah, whatever it is, the Pitchtronic 2000. Like they are gonna. So I'll be able to give you a firsthand report of the technical difficulties of this thing. I mean, I'm sure it's like what I want to know is what firmware is running on this stuff, and I'm sure it's all right. Well, that's a good. So the one thing I want to say is, if you, because Adam, I know you did not see Bryce Harper's at bat yesterday.
I have since watched it, and it was spectacular.
Oh man, that guy is so goddamn good. Steven, what do you feel about Bryce Harper?
He's just really, really, really good.
He is really, really good.
The difficulty is that, when you come into the league without much hype, it's just, I try to remember who said this the other day, but it's right, which was basically that he's going to be looked at as could have been more. And it's like, yeah, because, they made him out as like the second coming out of high school. Like
right.
nobody can live up to that. Like the dude's just really good. He's an excellent player.
He's really good, and so if you get a chance, and I promise this is the last on baseball, we'll get on to open source here in a second. But if anyone gets a chance to watch that full at bat yesterday, the scenario is there's a runner on that the Phillies are down by a run, and he's got a pitcher on the mound, Suarez, who I love. Great story. Took a long time to get into the league. Really a terrific pitcher. And Harper gets way behind in the count. He gets behind in the count 1-2, which was a 1 ball, 2 strikes. And I'm like I'm watching it with my kids and my son's a pitcher. We're both like, give him the off speed. And Steve, I don't know if you saw that pitch, but he gave him a perfect off speed slider, I think. But the exact pitch you'd want, he'd been pitching at 96, 97. This is coming at 92, dropping out of the zone. And it is a pitch that I don't think I've ever seen anyone. I mean, he laid off that pitch, which was extraordinary. The ability to lay off that pitch is like, and then hitting the home run on the next pitch. But he's very good.
Dude's legit.
He is. He's him, as the Youngs say. He's definitely him. All right, so that we got the baseball out of the system. That was fun. So Steven, in part we wanted to not just have you on here to talk postseason baseball, and our shared enemies, but this piece that you wrote, I guess like last week, right? When did it got picked up by Hacker News? I want to say like a week ago. That's right. And you called it the dead end. And this is all about this kind of trend that we have seen over the last 3 years, right? Because it was really in 2018 that this started, I think. Is that right? Something like that. It kind of the end of 2018 is that's certainly when I was like, when Confluent was one of the first ones. Who was the first vendor to do this? Like a couple of them did it.
I should know that. I don't. So basically, you had a couple of them that, each one, and this sort of remains true today. Each one that does it makes it easier for the next one to go.
Yes.
And the difficulty is we were talking to so many of the companies, either getting briefed or in some cases providing, sort of input on, some of these decisions, behind the scenes. So I'm trying to, that's a good question. I should know that. I should go look that up.
But I think you're right that each one of these made it easier. So I think it was, I want to say Mongo was early. I mean, there were a couple of them, and then they just kind of seem to accelerate. And next thing you know, it's Confluent, and then it's Cockroach, and then it's just a bunch of these folks. And they are, you phrased it in your piece. And Adam, I don't know if this resonated with you as well, but I really liked Steven's phraseology. Is like trying to have it both ways, and trying to have the kind of organic growth of open source with the honestly the margins and the lock-in of proprietary software. Steven, I assume that's a fair rephrasing.
Yeah. Yep. That's pretty much exactly what's happening. Basically, it's just they ultimately folks want to have their cake and eat it too, and This seems to be, the new direction, of the, at least from the commercial side of things. This is what people are doing. And, as we've discussed, each company that sort of follows this path makes it easier for the next one to do so. Very foolishly and far too optimistically, I don't know what year it was, probably 16 or 17, I had thought like, oh, hey, this is, going to be a short-lived phenomenon. And that's not up there on my list of predictions that I've thought of at this point.
I thought I was with you though. I thought it was there was going to be a short-lived phenomenon. I actually didn't think other companies. I'm like, all right, like Mongo has done this, but other companies won't, and it just like they kind of fell like dominoes.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that and I can't remember if you said it in the piece or if you said it in that Hacker News comment, but certainly something that I know you did see it in the piece as well. That part of the reason they fell like dominoes is because investors were actually pushing for this.
Yeah, so I'm sort of limited in terms of what I can say here because a lot of the conversations we have are either private or people tell me things off the record. But what I can say is that in I don't know, the year or two, again, I have to sort of have the time frame in front of me, but basically immediately prior to several of these companies' decisions, a particular investor organized essentially a I don't know, a meeting, call it what you will, sort of large scale open source commercial ventures with the express intent of encouraging them to go down this path. Some of these were portfolio companies, this particular investor, several were not, sort of had no relationship. And, a couple of those companies ended up going down that path. They sort of, interestingly and, I don't know, arguably problematically for them, they all went off their own path for the most part, right? So, if you look at one of the problems with this approach is that they've all done something different, right? It's not as if we've come up with okay, here's the flavor and it's the same standardized flavor and you prove it once, then you're good to go. Everybody's got sort of a little bit of a different variant. This is what the open source community fought for years is license proliferation.
Oh, God.
And so they all went off and did their own thing. And once this started happening, there were a bunch of other, sort of conversations amongst board members. Other investors, began to sort of agitate for this as an approach. So I'm trying to remember if it's a public source or not. So I probably shouldn't say. But anyhow, there was a sort of one of the founders of an open source company had said, hey, look, one of our investors came to us and said, hey, we want you to do sort of X, Y, Z. And he was like, no, we're not doing that. Because, in my words, not his, effectively this is a rug pull for all of the people who contributed, to our project under the terms of the original license. Right. So, it is, sort of, you see sort of the companies when they come out with this will typically sort of argue it in various terms, right? We need to do this because people are freeloading off the project. You see some defenders of these companies saying, well, they can't make any money, which is interesting because a lot of these companies have gone public and are worth, multiple billions of dollars.
Yeah.
But set that aside. And, what you end up seeing sort of, from different quarters is these different arguments sort of in favor of this sort of new style of license. But the worst to me are the ones that are the investors who are, they basically, hold themselves up as we're saving open source.
Oh,
And
God.
those are the ones.
That's
God.
rich.
That is rich.
Well, and the difficulty to me is that, look, if you are, if you're a company and you are pursuing a commercial endeavor behind a particular project, and more particularly, if you are responsible for all of the engineering, at the end of the day, you get to pick your license. Like, I don't think this is helpful. I don't think it's a good thing for the industry as a whole. But look, this is this is your effort. You get to pick, sort of what the terms of the license are, right? So that's, that can be frustrating to me at times, but so be it. It's funny. I talk to people and they're like, aren't a lot of these companies who've done this your clients? And I'm like, most of them at this point, either have or not. And And, people are like, well, how does that work? I'm like, I don't only consult on things I like, right? Not everybody does what I tell them. That's just not how our business works. But, to me, the sort of, like I said, the thing that really gets me are this investor class who has no sort of notion of the potential for collateral damage here. Doesn't really care, wants to make, their investments, sort of outperform, which, okay, look, they're sort of acting on behalf of their shareholders, but it's an extremely myopic view, which is focused on the near term. Can I make these particular investments worth more? And if a bunch of damage is done long term in the process, I don't care, right? I will have recouped my investment.
Stephen, there's a ton there, and one of the things that I heard you say and maybe missed in the article or in the blog post was this sort of smoke-filled room with like the CTOs of a bunch of these open source projects being like collaborating effectively. I mean, I know that I've got the visuals probably wrong, but that doesn't sound that far off.
I don't think it's that far off. At least it depends on who you talk to. It depends on, sort of which company you're talking to, right? And at what point, sort of they made some of these decisions. But yeah, there was a concerted effort, sort of on the part of investors to have some of these conversations. We had some of the folks come and tell us about that, like, hey, they're trying to get us to do X, Y, Z. I don't think it's the right thing to do, blah, blah, blah. But it's just, it is. I mean, in some respects, it's no different than the, sort of the hustle porn culture you see the investor class pushing, right? Because at the end of the day, it burns people out, destroys, families and lives and all that, but that's not their affair, right? They don't care. Collateral damage is not their concern, right? Their concern is, I want, sort of a particular return on my investment. And, if, some stuff has to get, ground up in the process, then, so be it, right? So,
yeah, and as you were talking about the proliferation of these licenses, I almost thought like that could be almost designed to kind of confuse the public. If they like landed on one license, then it's easy enough to vet and have opinions about and share them and iterate. And I felt like it was almost too conspiratorial to think, hey, get your own license, but maybe it's not.
I think honestly, they would have preferred that. I know, at least in one case, there was a desire to basically, have people follow, a particular chain. And this has been tried, right? So you've seen the Commons Clause, which now that's mostly now DOA, I believe. I don't think any of these sort of products or projects that used it still do. But that was an example of, hey, we want to push this particular approach and sort of standardize it in this way. And for those who are unfamiliar with that, basically the Commons Clause was a rider that attached to a given open source license that essentially made it proprietary software, right? It's basically if you this is Commons Clause, so the source itself is available, but it overrides and supersedes the terms of the open source license. So one, I had a problem with the terms, for sure, but the bigger issue is that it then attempts to piggyback on and masquerade as open source software, where once you put Commons Clause at the end of whatever the open source license is, the open source license part of it is not relevant any longer, right? Because it's essentially converted, by the terms of the Commons Clause. So,
so a couple of things. We're not going to get off the Commons Clause this quickly. Because I think that the name is gross. I feel like you see abuse of commons, community, all these things that imply sharing to imply that it's something other than what it is. I also feel like Heather Meeker, what the hell? I mean,
I was very surprised by that. And Heather Meeker, for those of you who are unaware, is a lawyer of some prominence who's done quite a bit of work in the open source space and was involved on the Commons Clause. And I won't say more than that. I was surprised by that.
Surprised, and then honestly, like anyone who talks about the Commons Clause is going to talk about Heather Meeker in the first sentence because they Meeker washed the Commons Clause. I feel because they used Heather's good name. I feel. And I don't know how she feels about it, but the whole thing is, I think, really, really gross. It's actually a relief to hear that you think that particular variant is DOA. But the part of the problem here is that and I don't know, Stephen, if you got the same issue, that they are kind of tacking into waters where there is not a whole lot of case precedence on software to begin with. And there's no precedence on any of this stuff, and there's unlikely to ever be. So, I think, it's not a legal opinion, obviously. For my legal opinions, I turn to my lawyer, Adam Leventhal. So I will. He's also my accountant and hardware engineer. So I'll direct any questions, follow-up questions to him. But I think that there is unlikely. This is unlikely to result in litigation, and it's unfortunate because there's a bunch of stuff in there. It's like, wait a minute, is this just like? What is this? Because one of the issues I've got with this, and Stephen, I don't know if you have the same kind of concerns, but if you actually look at these repositories, they contain language that looks like a EULA, an end user license agreement. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wait a minute. So in any end user license agreements, famously, just like it implies, you actually don't actually own the software. You actually have a license to use the single copy of software that exists in the vaults of Microsoft. This is kind of like the theory at the time. And it's like, what does a EULA mean when I can build the software myself? I mean,
yeah.
It's like,
and the difficulty to me in some of these is so as you note, right, there is a lack of case law behind a lot of the open source licensing we rely on today, right? So that is, sort of that's just a feature of the landscape at this point. But in other words, if you go look at some of these things, some of these licenses, you're like, wait, what? Right.
Right.
So I just looked it up. So the Commons Clause had a phrase in it that basically prohibited you from selling software if the value of the software derived entirely or substantially from the functionality of the software that you're combining with. And I'm like, okay, who defines substantially, right? Like, the lack of legal precision in some of these new licenses is just honestly, like, forget for what you think about open source or principles and all that. Just the general lack of legal precision in some of these is just horrifying.
Okay, so not to become too conspiratorial, but do you think that lack of legal precision is legally deliberate in that it is one lawyer broadcasting to another, like, hey, by the way, like, if you want, roll the dice, but hey, there's a lot of ambiguity here, and who knows what it means? And actually, your safest route is to just license the software from us. I mean, am I being too conspiratorial to think that?
No, I think that's, that is absolutely part of the intent, right? Because in other words, look, if you are a large business, there is zero chance you're ever going to leverage one of these licenses, right? Because you're not going to sit there and say, okay, nobody in this contract has defined substantial. So I have to, to protect my organization, I have to take a maximalist view of that, a conservative view of that, and assume it, pertains to everything, right?
Yeah.
So that's point one. Point two is that, I think, certainly what has happened in many of the cases here is that it's really difficult to do what they want to do, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that they're trying to thread this needle, which, I definitely don't want to go down the ethical license here, sort of rat hole here. But that's a whole nother thing where I'm like, people want to use licenses to solve these problems. And at least in my view, in a lot of cases, the license is not the appropriate tool, right? And, when you think about, sort of this new class of license, to me, it's not a license problem, it's a business model problem.
Yes.
That they are trying to address via license. Well, it turns out that's very difficult to do. And therefore, the licenses reflect that because there's no clean way to implement the language to say, oh, this is great, you get what you need, and I get what I need, and so on. And it's just, it's something of a mess.
So I'm going to actually combine two sources of frustration that I have with VC as an investment class into one superstorm of VC rate, if I may.
Should be
So I
good.
think so I think there are two problems here. One is that VCs are building to flip fundamentally. Their time horizon is so tight, 10 years, maybe 12 in some cases, maybe as long as 14, but a 10-year time horizon from first capital in to cash out is actually not how our most valuable company. That's not the time horizon over which our most valuable companies have been built. It takes longer than that to build. And so they're building fundamentally to flip. So they're looking for fast growth, and the open source software gives, and in particular, downloads gives you this illusion of product market fit, because it's this way of getting kind of what feels like zero cost growth. And then they want to monetize that, obviously, to create enterprise value for the company. But then the flip side is they only want to invest in software. So in other words, they don't want to, because like Oxide has got a very clear business model, right? We sell an entire system. And for us, we can very safely make all of our software is open source. It does not threaten our business model. We know exactly what we're selling, and it can be under MPL. It's like there's no funny business, there's going to be no weird relicensing from us, and ditto for all those companies that like Google and Amazon and Meta, for that matter, know exactly what they sell.
Right.
And they are able to open source this stuff and make true community contributions because they're not undermining their own. But these VC firms don't want to fund things. That gives them a kind of frustration. Number two, they only want to fund software, and if you and refuse to have a larger, more complicated system that you're actually selling to the user, whoever that user may be. And as it kind of gets them into this trap where they want it both ways. I mean, I think you nailed it, Stephen, your piece. It's like they really, truly want it both ways.
Well, there's one more piece to it too, which is nefarious, which is not only do they want to monetize it in this variety of ways, they want to prevent other folks from monetizing it. And that's where the sort of surprise it comes, when they start wanting it both ways. When they see, GitHub stars up and to the right, revenue at zero, and meanwhile other folks have managed to turn this open source software into dollars using, in many cases, their hardware investments.
Right, exactly. Their computers.
That's when it starts getting frustrating. When they say, "Why are these jerks making money off of my investment?"
Right.
Which is called open source software.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, it's like those companies too. You could not build. And I mean, Stephen, I'm sure this thought has occurred to you as well. You could not build Amazon, Google, Meta without open source software. Open source software was actually necessary to be able to build those companies.
Yes. Yeah.
But what about MongoDB, Confluent? I think the case is even more acute there. Whereas, agreed, you can't build Amazon, you can't build Facebook, you can't build Google without open source software, and yet they have I think that their open source contributions are not maybe as impressive or as ubiquitous as we would like. But the case for Mongo or Confluent, they're already standing on the shoulders of giants, but they kind of want to cut people off from the top. They don't want anyone standing on their shoulders.
Well, and Confluent. Yeah, sorry, Stephen. Good. Before I get myself in trouble.
No, I mean, all I was going to say was that, basically, the pattern here is pretty straightforward, right? Is that, you have projects that are released under an open source license, typically permissive. Then, there's exceptions. Mongo carried the AGPL up until the time it was relicensed. But typically these days, they're permissive licenses. And for the folks in the audience that don't know a lot about licenses, permissive basically imposes minimal restrictions, right? You typically have to reproduce the license itself. You have to, in some cases, convey patents, with Apache and, basically attribution, right? There's just not a lot you have to do. You could actually take, the open source software, wrap it up, as a proprietary asset and sell that, right? And that's what the licenses permit you to do. So a lot of these open source projects, are on the market, and some of them, for reasons that, may have something to do with technology, it may have, something to do with just ancillary factors, become sort of disproportionately popular. And this attracts a certain center of gravity. That gravity can fuel the rise of a company. And then, in many respects, the company itself and or its board and or its investors say, well, wait a minute, I'm making money off that, and that's cool, and I've been able to go public. That's also cool. But Amazon and Google and Microsoft, they can also do that, and I don't want that. So how do we cut that off, right? And that's ultimately the pattern. It's not super complicated at this point. And the difficulty is that what you end up with is a world where the pattern now is to basically sort of bait with this open source license, attract the community. Once the community is quote unquote too big to fail, you switch the license, and it's too embedded, it's too sort of everywhere. So we basically just have to deal with it, and we're accumulating more and more of these things over time, which then normalizes the behavior moving forward, and well, then you end up with the situation we're in today.
Well, and so it normalizes the behavior moving forward, which is bad. It also, I think, puts an impediment in front of more legitimate open source projects that don't intend to relicense. It erodes trust. So those open source projects that have copyright assignment, which, by the way,
Yep.
I think at this point, I don't think open source projects should have copyright assignment. I think that is the contributor's check, is to have the copyright be held by all contributors, which is what we do on all of our projects. And we're big fans of the MPL2 because it allows you, it gets you out from the kind of the DSOs, and there's a bunch of things that it gets you out of. And it allows all contributors to effectively hold copyright very easily. And then assures that you basically can't relicense, which I think is very important for contributors to know. Another thing that actually, I got to say, really rubs me the wrong way about, Adam, what you're describing, which to me is like these projects pulling the ladder up behind them. If you take, and I'm sorry, I'm going to name the names. If you look at Confluent, Confluent is based on Kafka. Kafka was developed at LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the one who, it's like, and I guess it's just, so it's like the irony of having ire that these companies are using, say, Kafka. It's like, wait a minute, what? Like, sorry, like LinkedIn did not have to open source Kafka when they developed it. They did that for a bunch of good reasons, including their desire to contribute back some of the social capital that they themselves had consumed, and then to turn that into a company. It's super dirty to me. At least to do it in a way that is not cognizant of the fact that the whole company relies on that kind of corporate benevolence. I don't know. It's one of these things where it's like, am I the only one that sees the hypocrisy here?
Yeah, it's just really difficult to, in my case, experience over and over. It's like Groundhog Day or Edge of Tomorrow or whatever, where it's the same scenario. And then every time one of the companies does this, people are like, oh, okay, so, what are you going to say? And I'm like, I'm going to say the same thing I said last time. There's nothing new here, right? It's the same thing. It's the same sort of relicensing. And, again, it comes down, it's a nuanced thing, because in the sense where, as we discussed earlier, if a company has singularly developed all the assets, okay, like I have less of a sort of issue with that. I still think it's bad, but look, they're within their rights. But in other words, you have a bunch of these projects which have taken copyright assignment,
Yeah.
From a community of contributors, and then switch the license on them, and it's like, oh man, like, and then surprise, all sorts of sort of downstream implications become evident, right? So in other words, you saw ACA, was relicensed, and it's like, oh, we didn't intend to sort of create this problem for the Apache Flink project, and it's like, yeah, that's why we have open source licenses,
Right.
not these licenses, because they work together and these ones do not. So yeah, it's honestly, I don't know what the fix is at this point, right? Because I've made the argument to, I don't know, probably every company at some point who's done this, and basically said, look, this is a business model problem. Here's the deal. Particularly on the database side of the house, I'm like, look, really what sort of the market wants is they want to sort of run this as a service. And it took all of them longer than it should have. They all, sort of more or less got there. And, sort of that is a scenario where if you are running that as a service, and sort of giving the developer populations what they want in that sort of form, the open source side of the house is a lot less, I don't know, it's sort of crucial to you. Like the software itself becomes, not irrelevant certainly, but it's not really what you're defending. You're defending essentially a managed service business, which is a materially better business for most of these companies.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, okay, what are you defending, right? Because in other words, you look at, for example, Mongo relicensed ostensibly to protect itself from the Amazons of the world, where Mongo was such a center of gravity that Amazon said, "Look, we're going to sort of service this one way or another," and they went out and just did sort of API compatibility in DocumentDB. And I had somebody try to make the argument, well, it's like, oh, they relicensed and that's why this didn't happen. I'm like, look, the launch of DocumentDB was like 4 months after they relicensed. Even Amazon does not spin up a brand new service in 4 months.
Yeah.
Like they, clearly did a clean re-implementation on their end because they didn't want to deal with the AGPL, which was the license that, was retired in that case. So it's like they relicensed, solved nothing really. It has, we talked to a large vendor. Oh God, I think it was first quarter. I think after that happened, I was like, "Yep, we're everything's on hold." Sort of with relicensing and so on. So it's like, most of these companies, as we've talked about, have hit a certain set of, basically gravitational size, right? Where they're not going anywhere, right? They're going to keep going up. More people are going to use them because once you hit it is very much a too big to fail thing. But it is absolutely a scenario where it's just, it's a problem, for the industry, because I can't remember if I used it in the piece or not, but I've certainly used it in conversation where it's like I had a English teacher at one point, I think it was in high school, tell me, look, you're going to have these philosophy professors in college, and they're going to tell you that Kant's categorical imperative is really hard to understand. And she's like, it is. But the only thing you need to know is basically it's like littering. If one person litters, it's not a big deal. If everybody litters, it becomes a big deal. And that ultimately is the issue here, where if you had a company here or there do it, okay, so be it. Not ideal, but survivable. But when it gets to the point that it is now, where it's becoming essentially a de facto pattern, from a commercialization standpoint, it's a problem long term for the industry, but B, I don't see any sort of market forces poised to address this. Right?
Well, so I guess one of the things that I'm curious about. Sorry, Adam, go ahead. Then I'll.
I want to say, Stephen, the title of the piece is Dead End. And I got to say, like, in some ways, I found that hopeful. Like, hopeful that maybe we've reached that dead end. But now it's almost more like a warning, right?
It was not a hopeful title at all.
No. But I guess the hope of it being that this is a dead end. That like we as an industry can't proceed out of this quagmire. But now it's almost like a warning saying this is the dead end we're heading to, and I don't see a way out once this becomes the prevailing way that software is delivered.
Yeah.
So Ian, you've had your hand up, and then I want to get to you because I know you've had your hand up for a long time.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about the timing of this post because a number of the companies we're referring to were covered under the 2019 post cockroach and the source available feature. So was it the ACA license change that prompted the post now, given that a lot of the companies that we're talking about, had already made these changes before 2019?
That's a great question.
I mean, yes, that was probably the precipitating trigger. But really, like I said, this is just sort of it's becoming a pattern. I think the thing that was significant and different about ACA specifically was that there were exceptions, but for the most part, the sort of blast radius here, as it were, was contained to the database space, right? Or sort of adjacent, streaming and so on. We hadn't seen, really, sort of this effort, go on in the sort of runtime category, as it were. And, my suspicion is that, Akka having done this, um, I think you'll end up seeing other sort of runtime projects follow.
Hmm.
And, at that point, it's one thing you can write it off. The database base has always been sort of a little different. And, if this begins to, sort of spread to adjacent categories of software outwards from sort of the database world, then yeah, I think it's very, very likely it'll end up being a sort of endemic pattern, something moving forward.
Yeah. So okay. So just to give you the other side of it, and maybe the hopefulness of the dead end. To Adam's point, I also feel though that we all watched open source software devour proprietary software. Proprietary software die at the hands of open source software when there was actually a huge asymmetry between them, with a huge disparity between them, even from a quality perspective, and but the economics of open source were so indisputable. And I kind of feel it's the same thing here, where when I've got a kind of strangely licensed variant or something that's going to require me to get a license from them to go use the thing that I started using on GitHub versus something that doesn't have any of those covenants or impediments, I'm going to naturally use the thing that and I'm going to go contribute to those things as well. I mean, I think that the one question I have for you is whether we are still seeing kind of downloads and GitHub stars up and to the right as a metric that VCs care about. Certainly, our VCs don't care about it, so it's not a question that has come up for us. Because I think there was a time when people were really viewing downloads as a proxy for product market fit. And I remember talking to I know we talked about this in the Docker episode, but I remember talking to one of the investors in Docker being like, hey, out of curiosity, like, do you think it's possible that these things are so popular because developers need something to serve a particular purpose, and they know that these things can't be monetized, that the popularity of them, it's not product market fit. It is actually that there can never be a true product market fit because you can't actually monetize it. And he was kind of laughing about it for a second. He's like, wait a minute, do you think that's true? And I'm like, well, I think it might be true. I mean, it's definitely true for us. I mean, if you look at the stuff that we are using, like we are not that we would necessarily be opposed to maybe some kind of support arrangements, but although we don't have any of those in place, but we are our stack is using all open source software. And yes, we use CockroachDB, but we're using the open source variant of Cockroach. And we are for every other component of the stack, we're using a true open source variant that allows us to give to redistribute what we're doing. And I can't imagine that we're the only ones that are, although Cockroach seems to tell us we're the only ones a lot. So maybe.
all I can tell you is that I joke about this with our clients all the time, right? Where we had they'll say, well, sort of what about lock-in and everything else, and I basically tell them variants the same story. So if you go out and talk to CIOs, and they'll all say something like, okay, yeah, I got locked into Windows and I didn't like it, and then I got locked into VMware and I didn't like it, so I'm not going to get locked in again. All right, you're like, okay. And they're like, okay, you're using cloud? And they're like, yeah. And you're like, okay, so what are you using for cloud? And they're like, well, Dynamo, Kinesis, Redshift,
right.
Aurora. And I'm like, okay, but these are all proprietary cloud services. And the gist of it, the lesson, as it were, is basically that, companies will tell you they're not going to lock themselves in, via proprietary software they can only get from one place. And if it is remotely more convenient, they will do it every day and twice on Sunday and not think twice about it.
Yeah,
it's just, that's the sort of way of the world. And that ultimately is what the investors and, sort of various members of the board have basically sort of realized, right? Which is that, okay, we can change the license and our large customers aren't really going to care because, we sort of quote unquote, they buy their way out of the license, by setting up a commercial agreement. And, we have the developer sort of support and popularity that we need now. So, we're not going anywhere. Nothing's going to sort of come along and eat us as far as they think. And, that's kind of where we sit right now, right? And it is, yeah, it is not. To Adam's point, it is not a hopeful dead end, from my standpoint, but quite the opposite.
So do you feel that this is going to spread to other, I mean, because certainly you talk about going into runtimes. I mean, one thing that it has remained completely open for the moment is compiler toolchains. And that is a big shift from 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see any, I mean, I cannot imagine any of that changing, in part because there are not venture funded companies behind these things.
I would be surprised. I mean, in other words, particularly from an enterprise software standpoint, really what these businesses want is they want to recreate historical businesses that they've known. And the compiler, to your point, the compiler business, obviously was proprietary. It was a thing, from a commercial standpoint, but it's not it's not viewed market-wise as the same opportunity, say, as middleware, right? So what a lot of the companies would like to do, if they can, is come along and basically say, all right, you know what? We had an entire class of businesses paying, just obscene amounts of money for their runtime platforms. Like, how do I replicate that, right? How do I replicate this sort of existing known business? Because ultimately, I mean, you look at the database space, that's the most obvious one, right? People looked at this, they got started with these developer-focused open source projects, and then somebody thought, you know what, it'd be really cool if we could make the kind of money Oracle used to. So how do we do that, right? And
right.
So I don't think that I mean, put it this way, if this ends up continuing, it could impact at some point every aspect of the market. But I think there's other lower hanging fruit that they'll hit first.
So what's next? What did you have some of that lower hanging fruit in mind?
Yeah, in this dystopian future we're heading towards, right?
Right. I mean,
honestly, I don't want to speculate as to projects and sort of motives and so on. But in other words, I think if Akka is any sort of example, I think we'll end up seeing some more plays in that direction. Right?
Yeah,
more
saying middleware, infrastructure middleware.
Yep. This is like a sort of an application platform. It's a middleware type play. This is a market where people historically have been willing to throw tons of money at it. So what's a popular open source project here, and how do we relicense it, right? So that would be my bet. But
would it be reasonable for folks to look to, for example, where projects where there is no copyright assignment, it really can't be practically relicensed. I mean, it is technically possible to relicense, but it's extraordinarily difficult.
With any, put it this way, I guess my answer to that would be with any sufficiently large number of contributors, right? So in other words, like Linux is effectively impossible to relicense, right?
Oh, Linux is extremely impossible to relicense. Yes. Actually, you want to, yeah.
I was going to say the sheer number of contributors, and in many cases, some of them are dead, right? So, then you're dealing with states and everything else. If it's a situation where it's a smaller team, right, of contributors, and they can be financially compensated, it's at least theoretically possible that you could see that sort of after the fact, sort of post facto copyright assignment. But no, when you have any sort of sizable community, sort of individual contributors who have not assigned copyright, then no, effectively it's impossible to relicense.
Yeah, and I think that number, I mean, for Linux, it is long past impossible. I think that number is way, way lower. I mean, for Linux, you have like a lot of dead people that have contributed to it. I mean, not to be too morbid about it, but the dead people are dead people or dead companies are the biggest problem, because those assets are now, or copyright in this case, is in the hands of someone who doesn't necessarily understand what it is and isn't. So they're like, oh, wait a minute, like, oh, is my house like built on an oil field? It's like, no, it's not. It's definitely not an oil field. We just need your permission to relicense it. It's like, well, if it's on an oil field, like, why do you need my permission? Like, I don't know, like, what's in it for me? It's like, well, kind of nothing's in it for you, but you need to do it. And this actually gets to another question of Godfrey, because one of the things you said is one of the kind of the hinky things, the the clauses in these licenses is this like time delay of like, oh, after 3 years it will be an all open source license. Right. And you had an interesting comment in there, and it kind of dovetailed into something else we said about the Spolsky piece a while ago about like, you're like, look, these companies know that the value of that software is basically zero. And it's like, it's a paradox, right? Because the value is not necessarily like the value of Bash is not zero,
right?
But no one is going to pay for Bash. It's like, and there's this kind of like it's like clean water at this point. It's like we just rely on it. It's a constraint of the infrastructure. And so it's extremely valuable as a constraint of the infrastructure, but it's not something we're going to pay for. And I feel like software has this more than other infrastructural aspects. I don't.
No, it's hard because, in other words, when I made the argument a number of years ago in a book called Software Paradox, talking about sort of the declining commercial values of software, right? And one of the things that came out of the conversations both that preceded that book and followed its publication was the fact that when we talk about value as it pertains to software, to your point, it's extraordinarily difficult to assess, right? Because the sort of value of a software on an individual basis can be immense, and yet I'm not willing to pay for it, right? I'm not willing to pay literally anything.
I'm not willing to pay I'm not willing to pay $2 a month. I'm not willing to pay for it. It's like, weird. I thought you built your entire company on it. No, like I have, but I'm definitely not spending $2 a month.
Right. And you see this all the time where it's like, you think about the havoc, that was wreaked when LeftPad, right?
Oh yeah.
Was taken. It's like everything breaks, and it's like, what is the commercial value of LeftPad? Well, I mean, nobody's really going to pay for that. But then on the flip side, you take it out of the equation, it's like a goddamn house of cards that comes down. So, the sort of value is difficult to sort of really assess, sort of in any meaningful way. But yeah, I probably should have been more precise and said, really what we're talking about is a commercial value, right? Because basically the reason that that style, BSL style license is willing to graduate these projects is because nobody cares about it, right? At that point,
right?
I mean, yes, if you're using it, that has value to you, sort of wonderful. But nobody's going to start a commercial competitor and say, I'm going to compete with these guys. I'm just 2 years behind them.
That's right. Remember, it's like retro databases. Hey, remember version 6? Right.
Yeah.
Stephen, just to pause, I loved the Software Paradox, and I just wanted to make sure that didn't skip by too quickly for folks. It's a great read for folks who have not read it, and available in major bookstores or whatever on Amazon.
Yeah, and it'll take you.
It's awesome.
And the primary criticism, just like the primary criticism of the new Kingmaker, is that it's too short. So
they are actually kind of short. They are a little bit short.
Well, hey, if you're a slow reader, then it's just very dense.
Right, they're good. They are great. Both books are terrific, and I would also say that in both cases, you were prescient. I mean, you saw this, I think, before the kind of industry writ large saw it, and saw the importance. And I think in particular, and you talk about this obviously in the new Kingmakers, but the developers making effectively business decisions about what components to incorporate. And I feel that part of the reason that these open source components do get this such momentum behind them is because you've got developers at the other end who are like, I need something to fill in this gap, and I'm not going to run a purchase order process for it. So I need something that I can pull off GitHub and just go. And then you've got these companies that are then trying to turn that, like, okay, so how do I become Oracle based on those number of downloads? It's like, you don't. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's like that is actually that Oracle represents a business model that really doesn't exist anymore. And I certainly get frustrated when people look at Red Hat as a model here, because Red Hat, not because of anything that Red Hat did incorrectly, but just because Red Hat was benefiting from trends much larger than Red Hat. And in particular, it was Intel x86 displacing all of the Unix RISC vendors. May they rest in peace. You kind of had, there were a bunch of things that were happening at once, of which the rise of open source operating systems was one component of that. And yes, Red Hat was able to build a lot of value based on that, but it's not necessarily replicable, I don't think. I mean, what's your take on that?
No, I think that's right. Red Hat has such a sort of unique set of I guess features, I guess you call it, in its evolution that it is, I mean, honestly, any of the standalone business, software businesses, right, are, can you spin up a standalone software business in 2022? For sure. Is it going to be anything like it used to be? Not even close. But to your point, the interesting thing to me, and this is, one of the sort of funny things, with talking to all these open source companies over time, I'm like, you can replicate that business. It's just going and delivering in the cloud,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you look at the sort of some of the numbers there, like Mongo, for example. It took them sort of a tick under 10 years, I believe, to hit 100 million run rate for their for the on-prem businesses or for the on-prem business. It took them, it was like 2.5, definitely less than 3 to hit that with the service business, right? The managed service business. So it's like,
Yes.
you
And then,
can replicate these margins, but you're not just selling the software. You're selling the combination of the software and the service and running it for somebody. And
and the margins will be lower. The margins are not going to be 90%. They're going to be
right.
65%. And 65% is a good margin around which you can build a sustainable company, Sand
But
Hill.
it's so hard when you're a public company to make that transition from 90+% margins to, a blended down with, pulling it down with that 60% margin. That's really hard for the street to swallow, I think.
I think it is kind of tragic that not that we should be embracing low margin businesses, but the fact that it's kind of 90% or bust from a margin perspective, because it's actually not the way the biggest, most successful businesses have been built. They've not, and this is, and I've mentioned, actually, Stephen, a pop quiz from Andreessen's 2011 Software's Eating the World piece.
Yeah.
Do you remember, can you name the software companies that Andreessen identifies as the paragon of the coming age of eating the world?
Oh God.
Brian's favorite party trick, to be
It
clear.
is my favorite party trick. Don't take it away from me.
Pixar, Dora. Oh God. No, I don't remember them.
Groupon, Foursquare, Zynga, and I've forgotten one other. But it's like, oh yeah. I mean, these companies are basically, they were sugar highs. They were high margin, flash in the pan, and they were unloaded by their investors. Made a lot of money for their investors. Did not necessarily make a lot of money for the Main Street investor, and are not necessarily. They're not. They certainly have not reached ubiquity. Certainly, no one is thanking Foursquare and Zynga for for delivering them tremendous value today. And,
that's awesome.
And it's like I really feel that in addition to I think decrying this behavior as we rightfully are, like we need software. Yes, it's eating the world, but it's eating the world in more complicated vessels. Like your services example from Mongo, it's like running services that's something that people will pay for because it's actually like work. It's not just like software margins. Not to get too much on a rant here, but I guess it's a little late for that.
I think it's too late for that.
Yeah.
I think it's way too late for that. But so, and then what has been the reception to the piece? So the piece kind of prompted, I think it sounds like, Stephen, like the Akka thing definitely was maybe what pushed it over the edge. What's been the reaction to it? Have you had any customers or any of your clients been like, oh, this is what you keep saying to us, right?
No, I mean, I think that it's honestly, it's a little bit like an earnings call, right? In the sense that it's kind of baked in at this point. Like my opinion on these subjects is not
right.
It surprises no one, right? Everyone has heard it from me before, to the point where
I know that feeling.
yeah, exactly. Adam Jacob was joking at one point. He had this thread on one of the, I don't even remember which relicense it was, and he was like, and shit like this is why SO Greedy like runs and hides like every time this comes up, because it's like I said, it's basically like Groundhog Day. It's like, here we go, turn them all over again. But people have heard it from me before. I think the thing, when it made Hacker News, it's like, I don't, for the most part, when our stuff, hits over there, like for programming language rankings, like I'll pop in and just sort of answer questions and things like that. Or if it makes Reddit, when people have genuine questions about it, that's fine. And it's always fun when you get somebody who's like, I don't think the author meant this. And I'm like, I am the author. That's always fun. But I don't typically wade into those discussions all that much because it's just, it's like any other sort of forum on the internet. It's not super productive.
Oh,
But
huh.
one of the things with, I'm a little more sensitive on these issues, largely because I just don't think, we have an entire generation of developers, not for, sort of anything that they have done wrong on their part, but they grew up in a world where open source was just the default, right? It was
Yes.
just, hey, we take it for granted. It's here. Of course, this is going to be open source and so on. And they lack the history of some of us who've been around and basically had to fight for this, to get it to where it is today. So, I will, when issues around the relicensing and so on pop up, I will occasionally pop in just to try to correct, what I feel are misimpressions of what's actually going on
Yeah.
or how this works, right? When somebody's like, hey, it's not actually, that I'm looking at the page right now, it's like investors aren't the primary motivating factor here. I'm like,
They kind of are, actually.
I can tell you, not in every case for sure, but I've I've been party to a lot of discussions that I can tell you the investors, either directly or indirectly via certain board members, have been tremendously influential. Right?
Oh,
So it's like,
and they've been on the record
have,
about it. They've been on. I
yeah.
mean, you go look at what Mike Volpe said about Elastic in 2017, 2018. I mean, it's like they've been on the record about it, index ventures. Like,
Yeah.
they've definitely been. They're not hiding. They're hiding in plain
No.
sight.
Yeah. So, yeah. So the reactions have been, I think from some, clients and so on, for the most part, everybody's just like, yeah, okay. There he is. It's like old man yelling at clouds, old man yelling at
Okay.
sort of open source licensing. But the reactions from a developer standpoint have been a little more frustrating.
So I think, but here's why I think that it's important anyway, because one of the things that I definitely wanted, actually, even in this very venue, we had this terrific open house a week ago, and I had actually a number of people who were at Oxide saying, hey, I just wanted to thank you for the Twitter space because I'm early in my career and I'm not always hanging out with engineers that are, 20, 25 years in and, or, 30 years in, 35 years in, whatever. And it's great to hear that perspective. And I do think that that is part of the value that to me, Stephen, you're not actually speaking to the companies that have already made this decision. You're not actually speaking to the venture capitalists that have already made this decision. You're actually speaking, you're speaking to the chorus. First of all, you're speaking to us, obviously. We're obviously grateful that you're putting words to it, but you're really speaking to that rising generation that is looking at this being like, that seems wrong to me. And it's like, if you're 23 and you're 25 and you're getting into the industry and contributing to an open source project, and your company starts to talk about relicensing, and that feels like it's a violation of a social contract. You're right. It is a violation of the social contract. And let us, the olds, tell you that your gut is telling you the right thing, that your parents did a good job raising you, and you do it. Yes, there's a social contract here. And it is not just you. And so I think, Stephen, this is one of the very valuable services that I think that you and we collectively can offer, is to speak to those folks who are not necessarily in the arena right now, but are very much watching.
Yeah, that's, put it this way. I mean, to your point, there are a lot of people who have made up their minds, sort of one way or another, right? And there are a lot of people who are just, sort of committed, to, I don't know, sort of apathy, sort of as an overstatement, but just, it's beneath their sort of regard, right? At this point, they have other things they need to worry about. But the hope is that if you can talk to, folks that are just like, oh, tell me more. Right. Because the difficulty is that, I mean, put it this way, you take, and this is absolutely a can of worms I do not want to open up. But in other words, when it comes to things like AI, right, and open source licensing and so on,
totally,
that's an area where I don't understand the implications of that properly. And I basically, for the most part, outside of some narrow areas where I have some expertise and I've had conversations in various spaces, that's the kind of conversation where I just sit aside and listen, right? And let people who are experts on this subject, just sort of guide my thoughts and impressions, right? And, you just hope that, in areas where these licenses are, ultimately going to be an issue that people will be at least open-minded enough to, sort of listen and say,
Yeah.
look, on an individual basis, this may not cause you a problem, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the proliferation of these things one after another. What does that look like, right? Because all of these things have sort of unintended consequences. I mentioned the Flink thing earlier. I'm quite certain that was not the intent, but that's what these things do. They introduce, by their very nature, collateral damage because they are intended to prevent certain use cases. And when you introduce that into ecosystems that have had nothing like that before, have instead been committed to open source licenses, which permit any use case, then all kinds of stuff is going to happen, and you're probably not going to like some of it. So, yeah, you just hope people are just willing to keep an open mind and listen to folks who have seen some things when it comes to licensing.
Amen. And fortunately, I got a lot of confidence in the rising generation. I think that they're very community minded in kind of a true and deep sense. So I'm optimistic that we will be that this is. I'm still optimistic, I should say, that this is a dead end question mark. Adam, I'm not trying to recast your title to make it optimistic.
No, I think the optimism is it's a dead end, kids. Stay away.
Right.
Like don't try BSL. It'll do you wrong.
Exactly, it'll do you wrong. Well, Stephen, really, really appreciate you joining us. It's been great as always. Thank you again for Monktoberfest is obviously terrific. Thank you everyone for indulging us as we talked baseball a bit. Hey, look, on the bright side, it wasn't cricket. I'm happy to go deep on cricket if you like. I just want everyone to know my self-restraint here. So, but a lot of fun. And like I said, thanks again, Stephen. Thank you so much also for joining us on the predictions episode. It was so much fun. And we'll have to do a predictions episode in 2023. So hopefully we'll see you then, if not soon.
Sounds like a plan. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.